So I am Andrew Foreshew-Cain. I am a Church of England priest, and I've been ordained for just 30 years and working in the Church of England. I was vicar of 2 inner city parishes in northwest London for nearly 20 years prior to retiring in 2017. And the reason for my retirement was that I was the first employed and therefore paid by the Church of England priest to marry a same-sex partner. Can you still see me?
Yeah, like your wallpaper.
Thank you. We moved here about 3 years ago, and we've been gradually restoring the house ever since.
Oh, great.
So in its 1840s was a vicarage. So we're gradually putting it back.
Yeah. So can I ask you to briefly summarize your biography?
Okay, so who am I? So I am Andrew Foreshew-Cain. I am a Church of England priest, and I've been ordained for just 30 years and working in the Church of England. I was vicar of 2 inner city parishes in northwest London for nearly 20 years prior to retiring in 2017. And the reason for my retirement was that I was the first employed and therefore paid by the Church of England priest to marry a same-sex partner. And I've been an LGBT rights campaigner in the church for 10 to 15 years. And after 3 years of abuse and harassment, my husband suggested that it was time to cut ties. So he got a new job here in Manchester, and we moved up, bought this house and settled in. But since last year, I was retired for about 1.5 years and I got rather bored. I have been employed by an Oxford college called Lady Margaret Hall as their chaplain. Now, the Church of England refuses to employ gay married clergy. To be a priest in the Church of England, you need to have a license from your local bishop, which is permission to take services. And the Church of England refuses to give licenses to married gay and lesbian clergy. So, but the good thing about Lady Margaret Hall is, although it's an Anglican institution, it was founded as a church-based institution and is required to have a Church of England priest as its chaplain, the local bishop has no control over the appointment of that chaplain. So the college appointed me, even though at the time the local diocese tried to prevent the appointment. So that's who I am. And I'm currently also head of welfare for my college. I took up that post at the beginning of term, 4 days before term started, in the middle of a global pandemic.
Oh, God.
As 460 students were about to arrive back on campus, bringing with them all the usual problems that students bring, plus a healthy dose of coronavirus.
Oh.
It's been a very interesting term.
Yeah, I suppose so. So why you have been, before your marriage, you have been like 14 years, a couple before this, no? So
yes, so Stephen and I have been together 20 years. And we had, I wear 2 wedding rings. The fatter one is because we had our relationship blessed by a priest in about 2004, before civil partnerships became possible in England, in the United Kingdom, and certainly before marriage was discussed. But we wanted to have a kind of official marking of our relationship. So we had a party and a priest and took vows to each other. And then when marriage became possible in 2014, 10 years later, we were legally married. The Church of England refuses to recognise marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples. So that service had to take place in a church hall, in a registry office, a town hall.
So they accept. I read that they accept gay person or homosexual persons, but they don't allow the marriage or to be or they have to live in a celibate, no?
So the official view of the Church of England is that if you're gay or lesbian or you know, non-heterosexual, you have to live a celibate life, and they require it. So although we have a number of clergy in civil partnerships, those clergy have to give assurances that they are non-sexual relationships. And of course, that's one of the problems of the Church of England is that the most clergy in those civil partnerships are not celibate, and the bishops know that they're not celibate, and the clergy know that the bishops know that they're not celibate, and everyone pretends that they are. So at the heart of the ministry of the Church of England is this fundamental lie, which I think is a problem in an institution which is supposed to be about truth and honesty and integrity, to have at the very heart of its ministry a widely accepted untruth and a colluded untruth is a problem.
And when you were living the 14 years before the marriage, did you live it like this, and then you decided it's, you know, I have to be more honest, or were you always a very open couple and everybody knew it, and then when marriage was possible you said, okay, this is our moment, or was it secretly in the beginning?
So when we first started dating, I wasn't going around telling everybody that I was dating Stephen, although that said, our second date was in a church party, a Foods of the World party. My parish is in a very socially and ethnically diverse part of London, and we had every year we had a big party where different people brought the foods of their native countries with them, and Stephen, our second date was at that. So Stephen came to that party, and people met Stephen at that party, and we'd only known each other 24 hours at that point, so perhaps we knew something even then. So we've been fairly open about our relationship right from the very start. And the blessing that we had after 4 years wasn't hugely publicly known, but obviously the wedding was.
Did you know what would happen afterwards, or?
No, not really, because what happened was that it became possible to get married. The law passed, and I asked Stephen to marry me on Valentine's Day in 2014. Oh. And then the next day, the bishops published a letter in which they said they would refuse to recognize marriage equality, and that if any of their priests married, they would take action against them. So I had already made it public that Stephen and I had got engaged. And as a result, quite a lot of press interest focused on the pair of us, because we were the first couple to kind of announce that we were going to get married. Now, there were other couples already planning to marry, but they hadn't made it public yet in the way that we did. So there's a couple called Jeremy Pemberton and Lawrence Cunnington, who actually married before us. And Jeremy is a priest, but he worked outside the Church of England. So although he was the first priest to marry, I was the first priest employed within the Church of England to marry, which is a significant difference, really, in some ways.
Do you think, I suppose this is the question that they always say, that you can, I can't see the problem, but there are a lot of people who say it's not possible to believe in God, to serve God like a priest, and then be homosexual or being even married. So for you, what was it at some time like a contradictory, or was it always for you totally normal?
So I wasn't raised in a Christian household. Well, that's not true. My parents were culturally Christian, but I wasn't raised within the church as an institution. I grew up as a young adult outside of it. So I didn't imbibe the kind of institutional homophobia and disgust that so much of the church has towards women, towards gay people in this country, towards people of colour. I managed to escape all those prejudices which are inherent in the church. So for me, being who I am and being a Christian was never really a contradiction. Plus, when I studied the Bible and read it in context, I understood clearly where what are called the clobber verses, which is what conservative Christians often use. There are 6, 7 verses in scripture which are often twisted to be used as attacks on gay and lesbian people. But when that's done, they're being twisted out of their original context and use as a way to beat people. I've always read those verses in context with an understanding of why they were written, when they were written, and what they were intending to address, rather than seeing them as a way to attack an inherent part of what it is to be human. So no, I haven't struggled with my sexuality and my faith at all. I know that I'm loved by God. I know that my faith is genuine. I have given 30 and more years of my life in the service of that God, and I'm happy with that.
And what do you think that it's such a big problem of other people, for other people? For example, now the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope also said, okay, they are not miserable, we have to take them on, homosexual people, but we don't want them to be, marry on the clergy. Why is it this?
Well, isn't it the same thing that you will have experienced as a woman? 100 years ago, people would have said that you, as a woman, should be in the house having children, doing the washing up. And it wasn't natural for a woman to have a job and to be in leadership and to be independent and to have their own money. These all things are culturally conditioned and a result of historical factors. And as it has changed for women, as it has changed for, or is changing for people of colour, so I think things will change with a growing understanding of the diversity of human sexuality, which is not a deviation from what it is to be human, but a fundamental part of the spectrum of what it is to be human. So I think it's quite natural for there to be gay people, to be straight people, to be bisexual people, to be asexual people. It's just a natural part of what it is to be a human being. And the church will eventually understand that in the same way that society is increasingly understanding that.
And I suppose they have to understand it, because if not, they're getting, they're not going with a present, no? They're losing members or not.
So I've been ordained for 30 years, and in that 30 years, the rate of decline in membership in institutional churches like the Church of England hasn't changed. It's been a steady downward path throughout that entire 30 years, despite an increasingly desperate focus on mission and evangelism and preaching and teaching the Christian faith. And none of those attempts to bolster attendance have worked. Back in the 90s, there was a thing called the Decade of Evangelism. For the last 7 or 8 years, our current Archbishop has been focusing on a program called Renewal and Reform. They've been trying to recruit more clergy. They've been trying to divert resources into pioneer churches, launching new communities, trying different ways of reaching people with a Christian faith. And none of it's working. People just aren't coming through the doors. And more importantly, Christian parents aren't raising their children as Christians. So you might have Christian parents, but very frequently the children don't follow their parents' faith. And that's partly because there's a fundamental mismatch, I think, between the day-to-day lived experience of people and what the church says about itself. And until the church addresses that, it's not going to stem the decline, no matter how desperately it tries to do so.
Yeah. Do you think, for example, this repressed sexuality also of the celibate, for example, for the Christian Roman Church, do you think this is one of the causes that you have the abuse cases of abuses, or don't you see this?
I think it's partly that, but partly also I think it's more fundamentally the sort of poor attitude to human sexuality and what a healthy human sexuality looks like. So it isn't just about paedophiles hiding in the church and using it as a way to access children. I'm sure that's part of it, but it's also partly about forcing people to live an unhealthy sexual ethic, and that twists and distorts people's very natural human appetites, and they will then express themselves in unhealthy and damaging and destructive ways. And that's what we've seen in the Roman Catholic Church. It's also what we've seen in the Church of England. A good friend of mine called Peter Farker was murdered. He was an older gay man, and he was targeted by a vicious narcissist who recognized that Peter had been hiding his sexuality for decades and decades and decades, and was in a particularly conservative church where his sexuality was known but not acknowledged. And it made him extremely vulnerable to this particular young man who targeted him, formed a relationship with him, lied to him, and eventually murdered him as a way of, he wanted to get to his money. And the report on Peter's murder talked about how the church's culture and attitude towards sexuality had contributed to making Peter vulnerable and ultimately leading to his death.
There was a case of a young girl, no, called Lizzie Lowe, no, that they say
that's right, Lizzie Lowe, and up here in Manchester, actually. Yes,
who was her? Why
so
was
Lizzie,
it a turning point?
So for Lizzie was a young woman in a very loving family in a very good church in Manchester, and a church which wasn't consciously anti-gay and lesbian, but had made the decision not to speak about human sexuality in any way because it was too uncomfortable for everybody, and they didn't really know how to respond. And that meant that Lizzie never heard positive things about gay and lesbian people. And as she was growing into her sense of self and her sexuality, the basic message that she got, even though it was an unconscious message, was a negative one. And she didn't believe that she could be loved because she became clear that she was a lesbian, and she killed herself. It's a terrible tragedy, and it's transformed that church. It's made them realize that by their silence, by their discomfort, by their refusing to address the issue, they made a vulnerable young girl desperate, and it led to her death. And that church has been utterly transformed by that recognition and has become a real haven and beacon of hope for a lot of people. And the church needs to understand, as that church has done, the impact of its silence, but also very often the impact of its negativity and cruelty towards gay and lesbian people. And I'm fine, I was brought up outside the church. I didn't imbibe those lessons. There's an awful lot of people I've met and spoken to, a huge number of people over the years who've been deeply, deeply, deeply damaged by those attitudes. And it's taken a lot of lives, and caused huge amounts of grief. Not just Lizzie, not just Peter, but lots of other people. I know, a significant number of people who are profoundly damaged by the church and its attitudes.
I was thinking, there are people who say that, for example, if being homosexual, you go to hell or you go to heaven. Where do you think you will go?
To me, I'm believing a loving God, so I hope no one can know, but I hope that I will go to heaven.
Yeah,
that's the hope, isn't it?
Yeah, I want to think a question. Your husband does he believe in God? And if not,
no, my husband's a very happy atheist, and always has been and always will be, and it's absolutely fine. We don't agree, and we agree not to. We agree to disagree on this and many other issues. It's one of the healthy things about our relationship, that we don't feel that we need to be exactly the same.
This is my question. How is it possible to believe so strongly that you dedicate the profession with all the knowledge we have of in our days, the scientific knowledge? So how it come that you believe so strongly in something you can't see?
I think there are two answers to that. I mean, I suppose I have always, even before I started going to church, had a very, sorry, that's the clock.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
I've always had a very strong sense of the presence of God. Even as a small child, the idea of God, the concept of God, has always just made sense. I've never doubted it. And that's the reason I started going to church when I was about 17. I just thought, I believe in God. I kind of sense a presence. Therefore, I should do something about it. And so my family didn't go to church. I just took myself to church because it seemed the logical thing to do. My first degree is in biology, in evolutionary biology. I see no contradiction between believing in an entirely natural world which has evolved and a loving God. They're answering different questions. Science is answering questions of fact and process and the how. Faith is answering the questions of why and questions of deeper meaning of existence. So I don't see the questions being necessarily contradictory. I do recognize that faith is a risk. One cannot know, but my choice is to live as if it's true. So I live as if my faith is true. And I find that that makes a difference in my experience of the world. And it gives me a vision for the world, which I find profoundly positive and hopeful. Because fundamentally, I believe in the goodness of creation and the presence of a loving God, and that the long arc of history is towards justice, because that's what God wants for us. And it gives me a framework in which to conduct my life, and in which to build my relationships with other people, and on which I feel I can rely. And I've been a Christian now for 40 years. And despite the actions and the attitude of the institution, which can often be cruel and heartless and unthinking, that hasn't affected my basic experience of God. So in my head, I make quite a clear separation between the institution and the people who are in it, and the God that it should be living and teaching about. I don't think it always does.
Is it easier to confront times like this now that everybody, is, has fear about death and so on? Do you live fear in a different way because you think that if you die, there will be hopefully heaven or something, it continues?
It's a good question. Am I less fearful of death than someone who has no faith? I'm not sure I'm less fearful, but I have a hope. Does that make sense? I'm 57 now, so I'm in the process of getting older, and I'm very conscious that there's more time behind me than there is time in front of me. And certainly in the last 5 years since I turned 50, that has featured a lot more in my thought processes than it has ever done before. I think that's a natural part of just aging. I haven't resolved that yet. I'm still thinking about it. They do say that your 60s are one of your happiest decades, because you've started to make sense of that and come to some degree of acceptance. I'm not quite sure I'm there yet, but does it help? I'm pretty sure. Well, no, I think if you're a devout atheist, you just accept that that's what you think, and that death is the end. And if you've thought that through ethically and morally for yourself, then that's a perfectly valid position to hold. For me as a Christian, I believe in a loving God, and I don't believe we just cease when we die. I'm not sure what that continuation looks like. I'm not a great believer in sort of fluffy clouds and angels and wings and harps and things, but I hope that there's some consciousness that continues. And I would say I'll let you know when I get there, but sadly I won't be able to do so. That's the whole point, isn't it?
Is it a problem for you, for example, if your husband doesn't believe, do you try to convince him, or do you say, okay, he's not believing, he's not finishing in the same place as I, or no?
No, I don't try to convince him. He has said, so there's a part of scripture which talks about the faith of wives being sufficient for their husbands. So Stephen thinks he's got a +1 card. If there is a heaven, he'll get in because of me. And I've told him repeatedly that I had a cat called Leo who I adored. So I've told him I've given my +1 card to the cat.
Yeah. No, because I'm, for me it's hard,
That's my doorbell, sorry.
You have to open?
No, Stephen will get it.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
My question is, do you think the period we are living now is like a lesson that God wants us to live, or do you see it in a metaphoric way, or do you see it, okay, there is a virus and we have to fight against it?
I think if we saw God, that this is a lesson from God, we'd be believing in a monstrous God, wouldn't we? How would God kill 1 million innocent people in a horrible, painful kind of way to teach somebody else a lesson? That's monstrous. No, I don't believe in that. If there is a lesson to learn, it's the simple lesson that if you mess with the biology and the ecology of a world, it's going to come and bite you on the bum. And that's exactly what's happened to us. If you're going to go and eat a bat with a virus in it, when you shouldn't really be eating bats with virus in them, then you're going to get sick. I think that's what's teaching us. So the lesson we need to learn is to have more respect for our natural environment, and try and come to a more balanced relationship with it. Whether we'll actually learn that lesson as a species, we've not really shown ourselves particularly adept at understanding the implications of our actions, have we? And sadly.
Yeah. And do you think there is something positive of this that we are living now?
So I think the international effort to produce a vaccine is hugely important because it's a visible and tangible doorbell again, pushback against. Sorry.
Don't worry. It's a nice doorbell. It's always.
Hang on, let me just.
Yeah.
Let me just go. Hang on.
Yeah. Don't worry.
Sorry about that. We're having because the house is old. We've been doing lots of work on it for years, and we've still got work going on it now. So there's work all over the place.
Don't worry. So the last question was, if do you see something positive from this Corona time?
So yeah, I mean, what I see as positive is the world reaction to the need for a virus, and how the international effort, bringing different countries and indeed commercial interests together to produce an effective virus in a vaccine in a very short period of time. It's an answer to the kind of isolationism and populism and nationalism that we've seen in the last 10 years rising across the world. It's saying that actually this is a hugely interconnected world, and that we have to work and function as a world community to rise to the challenge of world problems. And I think it's a very timely lesson, given what's happening with climate change and the issues that that's going to cause for us all. So I'm hopeful that national governments will learn from this, and that the effort that we put into meeting the challenge of coronavirus will help us learn to work together to meet the challenge of climate change. And I'm pleased to see that the new president of the United States is going to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords, that the government in this country is starting to bring forward some of its targets and changes to do with our own target of becoming carbon neutral. And I hope that effort now becomes a global, united effort, because otherwise we're in terrible trouble.
Yeah, you're right. So thank you very much. I will leave you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice conversation, and thank you for your time. Yeah.
We'll wait. Thank you.
Okay.
Take
thank
care.
you. Bye.
Bye now.
Take care.